3 days of walking had worn the soles clean off Lynette's shoes, and now, standing at the foot of the great stone stair, she finally understood that the road had been the easy part. The whole of Carnath rose above her like a mountain that had learned to hate the sky. Gray banners, gray walls, gray faces at every window, drawn and thin, watching the ragged little Omega, who had somehow talked her way through the outer gate. She could feel the weight of all those eyes on the small covered basket in her hands. "Keep walking," she told herself. "You did not come all this way to turn around on the last stair." The great doors opened before she reached them, and the sound that came out was not welcome. It was a low murmur, the kind a crowd makes when it has already decided what it thinks of you. The hall beyond was packed. She had expected soldiers, perhaps a steward. She had not expected the whole court of Carnath gathered along both walls, high-born wolves in their fine dark wools, turning as one to look at the thing that had wandered in from the road. "An Omega," someone said, not troubling to lower their voice. "All this fuss for an Omega, what is she carrying?" said another. "A basket. She has brought the king a basket." Lynette kept her chin level and made herself move. Sever one step, onto the cold floor. Then another. The murmur followed her like water rising around her ankles. Halfway down the long hall, her legs, which had carried her faithfully for 3 days and 3 nights, chose that moment to remember how tired they were. Her knee buckled. She went down hard on the stone, the basket skidding from her hands, and the whole court laughed. A guard seized her by the arm and hauled her up so roughly she felt something wrench in her shoulder. He drew back a hand to strike an Omega on the floor, being fair game for any wolf who wanted to look strong enough. The word was quiet. It did not need to be loud. It came from the far end of the hall, from the raised dais and the tall chair upon it, and every wolf in that room went still, the way prey goes, still. Lynette lifted her head, and for the first time she saw the Alpha King of Carnath. He was younger than the stories had made him, and grayer, a big man gone, lean in the wrong way, the way a strong tree looks in the season before it dies, with a hard, handsome face, and eyes the deep gold of banked coals. He sat very straight, and it cost him something to do it. She could see that. She had spent her whole life learning to see exactly that. This was a man holding himself upright by will alone, and hiding it from a room full of people who would tear him apart the moment they smelled how sick he truly was. Their eyes met across the length of the hall. Something passed between them that Lynette had no name for and no time to consider. Then a second voice broke the silence, smooth and amused and cruel. "Cousin, you are too soft," it said. "Look at her. Half the packlands are hollow, our own dead are still warm, and this creature crawls to your door with a basket of weeds." The speaker stepped out from beside the dais, tall, golden, beautiful, in the way a knife is beautiful. Where the king looked worn, this one looked polished, and Lynette understood at once that here was a wolf who had been waiting a long time for the king to fall. "Show us, then," the golden wolf said, spreading his hands to the delighted court. "Show us the great cure you have carried 3 days to bring us. Show the whole of Carnath what an Omega thinks will save it." Someone set the basket back in front of her. Lynette knelt over it. Her fingers were shaking, and, not only from the fall, she drew back the cloth. Inside lay a single sprig of a low gray weed, the kind that grows in ditches and on the edges of graves, the kind no one plants and no one tends and everyone tears out, emberleaf. The laughter that came then was worse than the fall had been. "A weed," the golden wolf said, and his smile did not reach his eyes. "She has come to mock a grieving pack. Take her out and hang her at the gate, so the next charlatan thinks twice." The guards had their hands on her before the last word finished ringing. Lynette did not fight them. Fighting would only prove her small, and she had learned long ago that the smallest wolf in the room survives by keeping her head when everyone else is losing theirs. Instead, she spoke, and she made her voice carry. which was the only weapon an Omega was ever allowed. "I did not walk 3 days to mock you," she said. "I walked 3 days because I heard the Alpha King of Karnath was dying, and his sister with him, and that no healer in these mountains could tell you why. I know why, and I can stop it. Give me one dying wolf, and 1 hour. And if I am the liar he says I am, then hang me twice." The hall had gone quiet again. The golden wolf, whose name she would soon learn was Corvin, laughed. But no one laughed with him this time, because grief makes a crowd honest, and every soul in that room had buried someone to the hollowing. The king lifted one hand off the arm of his chair. "My sister," he said. "Your Majesty," Corvin began. "Bring her," the king said, and did not look at him. They carried the girl in on a litter. She could not have been more than 16, and the hollowing had been at her a long while. Her breath came shallow and gray. Her wolf, that inner second self every one of these people carried, had already gone silent inside her, and Lynette could feel the absence of it, like a cold spot in the room. The court drew back from the litter without seeming to know they did it. Even here, even loving her, they feared the thing that was eating her. Lynette, no. She took the sprig of ember leaf from the basket and crushed it slowly between her palms, until the gray leaf wept, a thin green sap, and then she did the thing she had promised her mother, on a burning night long ago, that she would only ever do to save a life. She pressed her hands to the dying girl's chest, and she opened the door inside herself that she kept shut against the whole world, and she poured. It did not look like much from the outside. That was the mercy of it. A woman kneeling, with her hands on a sick girl, her head bowed, her lips moving. What it felt like on the inside was drowning. The hollowing rushed up her arms cold and hungry, and Lynette took it into herself and burned it away with the only fuel she had, which was her own life, spent one heartbeat at a time. The girl gasped. Color came back into her face like dawn coming up over a gray field. Somewhere deep inside her, a wolf stirred and whined and woke, and a sound of it, faint and impossible, made a hardened captain by the wall put a hand over his mouth. "Bryony," the king said. He was on his feet. No one had seen him rise. The girl opened her eyes and said his name, and the whole court of Karnath breathed out at once. For a moment, no one spoke. A pack knows the sound of its own dead being called back, and it is not a sound any of them had ever thought to hear. An old woman near the wall began to weep without shame. The hardened captain who had covered his mouth now stood with his fist pressed to his heart in the old salute the wolves of Karnath gave only to their own, and he was giving it, whether he meant to or not, to a barefoot Omega on the floor. Lynette sat back on her heels. She kept her chin up and her face calm, and she did not let a single soul in that room see what it had cost her, the way the edges of her own vision had gone soft, the way she could feel, if she looked, a faint new thread of gray creeping under the skin of her wrist, where none had been that morning. She folded her hands in her lap to hide them. Corvin was staring at her now with no amusement left at all. She had just made herself the most dangerous person in Karnath, and they both knew it. The king came down from the dais. He crossed the whole length of that hall on legs she could see were unsteady, and he stopped in front of her, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, as though she were a word in a language he had given up hope of ever hearing again. "There is a law," Corvin said suddenly, sharp from behind him. "An old law, cousin, and you will want to remember it. Wild blood loose in the pack is a danger to the pack. A healer of the old lines, unbonded and unclaimed, must be bound to the Alpha or put down. Those are the words. You cannot simply keep her like a stray." He had meant it as a trap. Lynette saw that much. Bind yourself to the Omega and shame your line, or kill the one wolf who can save your sister and prove yourself a monster before the whole court. Corvin did not much care which the king chose. Either one would cost him. The king looked down at Lynette, and something moved behind his tired gold eyes that might almost have been an apology. "What is your name?" he asked her. "Lynette," she said. Then, be bound to me, Linnet, he said quietly, so that it was almost only for her, and live. They bound them that same night, because a king cannot afford to let an enemy sleep on a chance to object. It was nothing like the joinings Linnet had imagined as a girl. On the rare nights she had let herself imagine anything at all, there was no feast. There were 9 witnesses, an old gray priest of the moon, and a king who swayed on his feet and pretended it was the candlelight. Emeric, his name was. She learned it standing beside him, with her hand on the cold hilt of the ancestral blade, while the priest spoke the old words over their joined wrists. Emeric of Carneth. War? She said it once in her head, to see how it felt, and it felt like standing at the top of a stair in the dark, not knowing how many steps were left. Corvin stood among the witnesses, because a king could not bind himself in secret, and Corvin had made certain to be seen. He watched the whole of it with the patient look of a man watching a house he intends to inherit. When the priest bound the ribbon over their wrists and named them one, Corvin was the only wolf in the room who smiled, and Linnet marked that smile and put it away with the other things she was keeping, the gray at her wrist and the cough she had not yet heard, and the growing certainty that she had wandered into a war and been made its newest banner. He did not once look away from her during the binding. She found that harder to bear than any of the sneering had been. She was not used to being looked at as though she were worth the trouble of looking. When it was done, and the witnesses had gone, and the great door of the royal apartments had closed on the two of them, and all the terrible expectation of a wedding night, Emmerich surprised her. "You will have the inner chamber," he said. "It has its own bar on the door. I will take the outer room." He was already turning away as he said it, already lowering himself with great care into a chair by the fire as though the walk across the hall had emptied him. "No one will trouble you tonight. No one will trouble you any night, if I have my way. Until you wish it. That is a promise, and I keep my promises. It is very nearly the only thing I have left to keep." Linnet stood in the middle of the room, waiting for the trick, because in her experience, kindness was always the wrapping around a trap. There was no trick. He simply sat and let her watch him, and after a while he said, not unkindly, "You are exhausted. Go and rest. We can be strangers to each other in the morning as easily as we can tonight." "Why?" she asked him. She had not meant to. The words simply came out of her, worn thin by 3 days of walking and 1 endless hour of drowning in another wolf's sickness. "Why be kind to me? You did not choose this any more than I did. You could put me in the low cells with the other things you use, and forget where you left the key." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. "Because I have watched a great many people be unkind to those beneath them," he said at last, "and I have never once seen it make the unkind wolf any stronger. Corvin thinks cruelty is a kind of power. He is wrong, and one day it will cost him." He turned his head toward the fire. "And because you knelt on my floor in front of every wolf who has ever wished me dead, and you gave my sister back to me, and you asked for nothing. A man remembers who asked for nothing." Linnet did not know what to do with that, so she did what she always did, with things too large to hold. She set it down carefully and stepped away from it. "Good night, Your Majesty," she said. "Emmerich," he said, "if we are to be strangers, we may as well be strangers who use each other's names." So she went into the inner chamber, and she barred the door, and she was glad of the bar, for a reason he could never be allowed to guess. Because the moment she was alone, she let go, and the cost came due. She sank down against the barred door and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, and shook. The thread of gray at her wrist had spread in the hours since the hall. It ran up her forearm now in a fine pale web, the exact color of the sickness she had pulled out of the king's sister, and she watched it in the low firelight with the calm of someone who has seen her own dying many times, and simply not mentioned it to anyone. This was the truth she carried, heavier than any basket. The emberleaf did not heal. It never had. It was only a door, a humble gray weed that opened the way. What healed was Linnet, her own blood, her own years, poured out drop by drop into the sick and the dying. Every wolf she saved, she paid for. The old healers of the Ashvale had all died young and hidden, and now there was only her, the last green-blooded daughter of a hunted line, and she had just promised a whole withering pack, the one thing that would use her up. There was a measure to it. She had learned the hard way. A cut, a fever, a birth gone wrong. Those cost her little, a night's weariness and no more. But the hollowing was not a wound. It was a hunger, an unmaking, and to pull it out of another wolf, she had to feed it something living, or it would simply crawl back. So, she fed it herself. Each dying wolf she brought back left its mark under her skin in that fine gray web, and the webs did not fade the way the hollowing faded from the ones she saved. They stayed. They joined. She had counted them, once, the way you count coins you cannot spare, and then she had stopped counting, because knowing the number did not change the road and only made it colder. She could save Karnath. She was almost certain of it now. She simply could not save Karnath and herself, both. Keep it hidden, her mother had said, in the smoke at the end. If they know what it cost you, the good ones will stop you to save you, and the bad ones will bleed you to save themselves. Either way you lose, so you smile in the daylight, my linnet, and you fall apart alone in the dark, and you never, ever, let them see the gray. She wound a long cloth around her forearm until the gray was covered, wrist to elbow. In the daylight she would wear long sleeves. In the daylight she would be the calm and capable healer who had saved the king's sister. Only here, only at night, only behind a barred door, would she be what she truly was, which was a candle, burning itself down, to save a house full of strangers. She did not sleep so much as stop. Near dawn, a sound woke her, low and rhythmic and quickly stifled, coming through the door from the outer room. She lay still and listened. It was the king. He was coughing, the deep, wet cough of the hollowing, the cough she had heard in 100 dying throats, and he was holding a cloth to his mouth to muffle it so that even the walls would not carry word to Corvin that the Alpha King of Karnath was already, quietly, on his way to the grave. Linnet lay in the dark, with her gray arm wound in cloth, and listened to her new husband hide his dying, exactly as she was hiding hers, each of them behind their own barred door. She said nothing. What was there to say? But she lay awake a long time after the coughing stopped, staring at the ceiling, thinking that she had walked 3 days to save a stranger and had married one instead, and that the two of them were more alike than he could possibly know. Karnath did not soften toward her. If anything, saving the king's sister had made it worse. An Omega might be pitied. An Omega who could do what the great trained healers could not, was something else, something that upset the order of things, and the court of Karnath loved its order the way a drowning man loves a rope. They watched her in the halls. They fell silent when she passed, and spoke the moment her back was turned. She caught the words, anyway. Witch. Weed woman. The stray the king dragged in from the road. And beneath all of it, quieter and more dangerous, the one that mattered. She unmanned him. He was strong until she came. She learned the shape of the court quickly because her life depended on it. Corvin was the center of it, the king's own cousin, a wolf with a claim to the alpha line only a little weaker than Americ's own and an ambition a great deal stronger. He did not rage at her. That was what made him frightening. He smiled, and he waited. And he gathered the frightened and the grieving to him one funeral at a time, and at his side, always, was Delphine. Linnet understood Delphine before they had exchanged a dozen words. She was highborn and lovely, and had spent years arranging herself to become the Alpha's mate. And then a barefoot Omega had walked in off the road and taken the place she had counted on as her own. She hid it beautifully. She was the first to curtsy, the first to smile, the first to press Linnet's hands and say how glad she was, truly, that dear Bryony was recovered. Every kind word she spoke was sharpened on the back before she handed it over. You must find it all so overwhelming, Delphine murmured to her. 3 days into it, in the long gallery, where the whole court could hear, to go from the road to the royal apartments in a single night. However, will you learn our ways in time? She tilted her head. And you, so pale, always. Are you quite well, healer? You look as though you might blow away. Lynette felt the gray under her sleeve like a brand. It is only that I keep late hours. There is a great deal of sickness in Carneth, and it does not rest. So, neither do I. That was true, and it was also her armor, and Delphine's smile flickered, because a good answer is the one thing a cruel question cannot survive. By day, then, Lynette worked. She went where the hollowing was worst, into the low houses along the wall, where the court never set foot, and she saved who she could and paid for each of them in gray. She was careful, she spaced them out. She told herself she was managing it. The way a person deep in debt tells herself she is managing it, and by night, strangely, impossibly, she began to have something she had never had in her life. She had a friend, and he was the king. It began because neither of them could sleep. She would hear him moving in the outer room in the small hours, and one night, half from worry and half from a loneliness she was ashamed of, she unbarred her door and found him at the cold hearth, with his head in his hands, and instead of retreating she sat down across from him and said, "You should let me look at you." "No," he said, "not me. Because if I heal the king looks weak," she finished for him, "and weak kings do not keep their crowns long in a court like this one." He looked up at her, surprised, and then he almost smiled, and it changed his whole worn face. "You see a great deal," he said. "For a woman who has been here 3 days, I have been the weakest one in the room my entire life," she said. "You learn to watch the strong ones. It is how you stay alive." So they did not heal each other. They talked instead. Night after night, at the dead hearth, a dying king and a dying healer, who each believed the other did not know, and who each found, to their own surprise, that they did not want to go back behind their doors. He told her about Bryony, about raising her after their parents went to the last plague, about how he had never wanted the crown and had been given it anyway. She told him carefully edited truths about the ash veil, about a healer mother, about a fire. He did not push at the edges of what she left out. She loved him a little for the things he chose not to ask. He asked her another night what the ash veil had been like before, and she told him about the terraced gardens climbing the mountainside, every ledge a different green, and the way the whole valley had smelled of crushed herbs after rain. She did not tell him what had happened to it. He seemed to understand that there was an after she would not name, and he stepped around it as neatly as he stepped around his own cough, and in the stepping around they came to understand each other better than most wolves do who share a name for years. She made him laugh once, telling him about the time she had mistaken a visiting lord's prized hunting hound for a stray and dew-wormed it, and the sound startled them both. It was rusty and surprised, and far too loud for the hour, and he clapped a hand over his own mouth like a boy, and Lynette found she was grinning into the dark of the dead hearth like a fool. "You are the first person in a year," he told her that same night, "who has looked at me and not seen either a throne to want or a corpse to plan around. I had forgotten what it was like, to simply be spoken to." Lynette held very still, because the warmth that went through her at those words frightened her more than Corvin ever had. She could not afford this. A candle does not get to fall in love with the house it is burning down for. And there was worse in it than that, a thought she turned away from as fast as it came. If she let herself love him, she would not be able to stop herself from saving him. And saving him would take more of her than any wolf in that hold, because the hollowing had its hooks deepest of all in the king. She was still telling herself that when the door of the gallery burst open the next afternoon, and a white-faced servant cried that the young Lady Briony had collapsed at her lessons, grey to the lips, the hollowing risen in her again worse than before. And that was not the worst of it. Behind the servant, filling the doorway, came Corvin, and he was not troubling to hide his smile now because he had just understood something Lynette had been praying. He never would. "Your cure does not hold," he said softly. "To her, to the king, to the gathering court, it fades. Whatever the little witch did, it is coming undone." He let that land. Then he turned to the pale and frightened nobles behind him and spread his hands wide. "How many more of your children?" he asked them gently. "Will you let her practice on?" Lynette saved Briani a second time before the sun went down, and it frightened her far more than the first. She knelt at the girl's bedside, with the court crowded in the doorway, to watch her fail, and she did not fail. She crushed the ember leaf and opened the door in herself and poured, and the gray went out of the girl and into Lynette, and Bryony sat up, asking for water, as though she had only fainted. The court murmured. Corvin's face did not move at all, which told Lynette more than any words could have, because Corvin was not surprised. And a wolf who is not surprised to see a healing come undone is a wolf who already knew it would. She understood it then, kneeling on that floor with fresh gray climbing past her elbow. The hollowing did not behave. Sickness has rules, even cruel ones. It comes, it takes, it either kills or it breaks, but it does not lie quiet in a healed body and then bloom again 3 days later from nothing. Something was putting it back. Someone was feeding the pack its poison a little at a time, and calling it a curse, and letting a barefoot Omega exhaust herself bailing out a boat, while a hand she could not see kept drilling holes in the hull. She said none of this aloud. She had no proof, and an Omega with an accusation and no proof is simply an Omega who has talked her way onto the gallows, so she began instead to look for the hole in the hull. In the low houses, she asked the sick what they ate and drank, careful, offhand, the ordinary questions of an ordinary healer. The answers were all different but for one thing. Every household in Carneth drew its water from the deep moonwell in the lower court. The old blessed spring the pack had trusted for 100 years and more. And when Lynette drew a cup of it herself, late, when no one was watching, and held it up to the light of her candle, she thought she saw at the very bottom, so faint she might have dreamed it, the ghost of a gray silt that no clean mountain spring should ever carry. She poured it out and told herself she had imagined it. She did not believe herself. So she smiled. And she told Bryony to rest, and she wound another length of cloth around her own arm that night, and she began, very quietly, to watch. The nights with Emeric became the only hours she did not have to pretend. They fell into it the way tired people fall into anything that does not hurt. She would unbar her door, and he would already be at the cold hearth, and they would talk until the candle guttered. She learned that he had a dry, buried humor that only came out in the dark. He learned that she could name every plant on the mountain and most of their uses and had opinions about all of them. He asked her once, very gravely, whether it was true that an Omega could smell a lie. She told him, just as gravely, that she could smell a great many things, and that his boots were chief among them. And he laughed the rusty laugh again and threw a cushion at her across the dark. It was such a small and ordinary and human thing that it undid her more thoroughly than any kindness could have. No one in her whole life had ever thrown a cushion at her in play. She had to look very hard at the fire for a moment, so that he would not see her face. Once she reached to take a cup from his hand, at the same moment he offered it, and their fingers met, and both of them went utterly still. Because something passed between them, it was not warmth, or, not only, it was a pull, low and deep, like two streams finding the same channel in the dark. For one heartbeat, Lynette felt the whole weight of the hollowing that lived in him, vast and patient, and far worse than she had feared, and she knew with a sick lurch that in the same instant he must have felt something reaching back out of her, some cold gray thread she could not call back in time. They both let go of the cup at once. It fell and cracked on the stones between them. "Forgive me," he said too quickly. "No," she said, "it was mine." Neither of them was talking about the cup. She knew what it was. Her mother had warned her of it long ago, the way she had warned her of everything that could kill them. A mate bond forming, two wolves whose halves fit, whose bodies had begun, without permission, to reach for each other. In any other life it would have been a gift. In this one, it was a loaded trap, because a bond meant no more hiding. A bond meant he would feel her dying as surely as she had just felt his. And worse, far worse, it meant her healer's gift would turn toward him like a flower turns to the sun. She would not be able to stop herself from pouring into him. And he was the most hollowed wolf in Karneth. Killing him would not cost her a little gray. It would cost her everything she had left. So she did the only thing she could. She pulled back. She kept the width of the hearth between them. After that, when he reached, she found a reason to be reaching for something else. She watched his face learn, night by night, that she would not be touched, and she watched him decide, wrongly, that it was because she did not want him, and she let him believe it, because the truth would kill them both. It was a particular kind of cruelty, the closeness they had now. To sit an arm's length from the one person she had ever wanted to be near, and to talk with him until dawn, and to keep her hands folded in her lap the whole while, like a woman in church. Some nights, the pull was so strong, she had to leave early and lie behind her door with her fists clenched, furious at the fairness of a world that had shown her exactly what she could not have, and then set it down within reach. It was on one of those nights, coming back late through the dark servants' passage from a sick child in the low houses, that she heard the two voices she least wanted to hear. She froze against the cold stone. Through a half-open door she could see the edge of the small east solar, firelight, two figures close together. Corvin and Delphine, with her hand flat against his chest in a way no ally's hand ever lies. "The little witch is thinner every week," Delphine was saying, and there was laughter in it. "Have you seen her? She heals them, and it never holds, and she gets grayer, and my dear cousin the king gets weaker, and all we do is wait." "Patience," Corvin said, and kissed her hair. "As long as the well runs gray, they all keep dying, and the Omega keeps spending herself trying to stop it, and the pack keeps looking at a king too feeble to save them. He does not even know his own cup is killing him." He raised a glass toward the fire in a small mocking toast. "To my cousin's excellent health." Delphine laughed softly and turned in his arms. "And when he is gone," she said. "When the pack has watched him wither past all saving and the Omega has spent the last of herself trying to hold him together, then the crown has no heir but me," Corvin said, "and the pack begs the strongest wolf left standing to take it up, and grieves, and calls it mercy." He smoothed a strand of hair from her face. "And you will stand beside me, where you were always meant to stand, a little longer. That is all. Let the gray do our work for us." Lynette did not breathe. She had her proof, now, every word of it, and it was worth exactly nothing, because it lived only in the ears of an Omega. No one would believe against the king's own blood. The well runs gray. His own cup is killing him. She pressed both hands over her mouth and backed away into the dark one. Silent step at a time, and she carried what she had heard up to the barred room, like a coal, held in a bare palm, knowing she could neither drop it nor keep holding it much longer. After that, Lynette stopped sleeping almost entirely. She knew who was killing them, and how, and she could tell no one. She could not go to the court, who worshipped Corvin and despised her. She could not go to the captains without proof, and proof meant catching the poisoning as it happened, and she was one exhausted woman fraying at the edges, and the pressure was mounting on every side. The whispers in the halls had grown teeth. It was said openly now that the king's rule was a dead branch waiting to fall, that a bound pair with no true bond and no heir was no pair at all, that Karneth could not afford a sickly alpha and his weed witch while strong wolves stood ready to lead. Corvin fed every one of those whispers and pretended to quiet them. Each day, Emmerich looked grayer at the council table, and each day, fewer wolves met his eyes, and Lynette watched the whole slow avalanche gather above his head, and could do nothing but count the stones. Worst of all, she now knew the thing she had been trying not to know. Emmerich was being murdered slowly in his own hall, and he was the one wolf whose life the hollowing had gripped so deep that saving him would empty her out like a poured jug. And still, heaven help her, she wanted to. She told herself it was only duty. She had walked 3 days to save this pack, and the pack could not stand without its king. That was reason enough to do what she was turning over in the dark. But underneath the good clean reason lay another, warmer and far more dangerous. And it was simply that she could not bear to sit at that hearth one more night and listen to him hide his cough and do nothing. So she went to him. Not in the small hours this time, but in the failing light of early evening, when he was at the window watching his mountain go dark. "Let me bind to you." "In truth," she said. He turned. Whatever he had expected her to say, it was not that. "The court thinks our joining a sham," she went on. Before her courage could fail, an omega and a weed witch. No true bond, no heir, a marriage of convenience that convinces no one. Corvin uses it against you every day. A true bond would silence half of them, and a true bond, she made herself say it, would let me help you. As I cannot now, she watched hope flare in his gold eyes, quick and helpless before he crushed it. She felt it too, through the space between them, that low pull, leaning toward her like a tide. For one breath she was certain he would cross the room. He did not. "No," he said. The word was very quiet, and it took something out of him to say it. She could see that, but he said it, and then he made it worse by trying to explain. "You do not understand what you are offering," he said. "A true bond is not a ribbon over the wrist. It ties 2 lives into one thread. It cannot be cut, and it cannot be undone, and what happens to the one, happens to the other." He looked at her, and there was something desperate under the calm. "You are young, and you are the last of your line, and you should not tie your one wild life to," he stopped, "to this, to me, to Karnef as it is." "Then let me decide what my life is worth," she said. "It is mine to spend." "Not on me," he said, and there was iron in it, and grief. "When this is over, whatever comes, you should be free to walk back down that mountain and live. That is the one thing I can still give you. I will not take it back by binding you to a sinking ship." She heard none of the love in it. That was the cruelty of the thing. She heard only an alpha king, worn and dying and proud, refusing to lower himself into a true bond with the omega he had been forced to marry. She had offered him the deepest thing she had, and he had told her, kindly, to keep it and go home. "I see," she said. "Linnet," he began. "You have made yourself very clear, Your Majesty," she said, and she was proud, later, that her voice did not shake. "Forgive me for suggesting it." She left before he could stand, and she did not go back to the hearth that night, or the next, or the one after that. She lay behind her barred door, with her gray arm across her eyes, and let herself understand, fully and finally, what she had refused to see. She could burn herself down for these people, but she could not be wanted by them, not truly. She was a tool that healed and a stranger who would be sent home when the work was done, and the warmth she had let herself feel at that cold hearth had been a story she told herself in the dark, nothing more. She wept a little, which she almost never allowed, and then she was done with it. Tears were water, and water was strength, and she had none of either to waste. In the gray hour before dawn, she made herself a colder and simpler promise than any bond. Very well, she thought. If she was only a tool, she would be the best tool a dying pack had ever owned. She would save who she could, and she would find her proof, and she would stop grieving a bond she had been a fool to reach for. She would not offer her heart again to a wolf who kept handing it back to her, folded neatly like a borrowed cloak. She had almost convinced herself of it when Corvin announced the moonrite. The moonrite was the oldest thing the pack of Karneth still did. Once a season the whole hold gathered in the high courtyard under the open sky, and the Alpha stood before them, and shifted into his wolf, and by the strength of that wolf, the pack read the strength of their king. It was not a ceremony, A failing alpha could refuse without confessing everything. Corvin knew that, of course. That was why he had called for it, smiling, before the full court, framing it as a comfort. Let the people see their king in his power, he had said, in these frightening times. Let them be reassured. And Emmerich, trapped, had inclined his head and said the pack would have its right. There was no way out of it that Lynette could find, and she looked. To refuse was to confess weakness and hand Corvin the crown. To stand before the pack and fail to shift was worse. A public unmasking that no king survived. And to shift, if he even could, would tear through what little life the hollowing had left him, and finish in one night what the poison was doing by inches. Corvin had built a door with nothing but walls behind it, and he had done it in front of the whole court, wearing the face of a loyal cousin, and every wolf in Karnath had thanked him for his kindness. He cannot shift, Lynette thought, watching from the edge of the courtyard, as the torches were lit and the pack pressed in. He is too far gone. Corvin knows it. This is not a rite. This is an execution with a nicer name. She had sworn to keep her distance from him. She stood at the edge anyway, her hood up, her gray arms hidden, and she watched Emmerich walk out into the center of the ring under the risen moon, tall and steady by sheer will, and she felt her own heart climbing into her throat. He got as far as loosening the collar of his shirt. Then two things happened at once. The moon caught the sweat standing out on his gray face, and every wolf in that courtyard understood, in a single indrawn breath, that their king was sick unto death. And from the shadow of the north arch, a shape came low and fast across the stones. It had been a wolf once. Now it was something the hollowing had eaten down to teeth and hunger, a beast driven mad by a killing dose, loosed into the crowd. And it was not running at the king, it was running at Lynette. Later she would understand it. A mad thing does not choose. Someone had pointed it, the way you point a loosed arrow, and someone had pointed it at the Omega who kept ruining everything, in a crowd, in chaos, where one more death would be just another sorrow of a cursed season and no blade to trace to any hand. She had no time to run. She saw the teeth and the milk-white eyes, and she thought with a strange flat calm, so this is how. And then Emmerich was there. He should not have been able to move that fast. A dying man, half across the ring, with no wolf left to call. But something in him that was not strength and was not health, something older and fiercer than either, crossed the stones in the space of a heartbeat and put his own body between Lynette and the teeth. The beast hit him instead of her. They went down together in a tangle of snarling and torn cloth and shadow. Emmerich got a forearm across the thing's throat, holding those snapping jaws a hand's breadth from his own face, and Lynette heard him make a sound she would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. A low, straining grunt of a man spending the very last of himself to buy a few more seconds for someone else. The courtyard erupted. Wolves surged forward, too slow, always too slow. Someone brought the mad thing down at last, and it shuddered and folded and went still. And when they pulled it off him, Emmerich lay on the cold stones gravely hurt and unmoving, and he did not get up. Lynette was on her knees beside him before she knew she had moved. He was badly hurt, his breath coming shallow. His eyes found hers, and even now, even broken on the stones, the first thing he said was not a cry of pain. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. Her hands were already on him, pressing the wound. And through that contact the hollowing in him rushed up her arms, so vast and so close to the end, that she nearly cried out. He was not merely wounded. The wound had only torn the last veil off what was already true. He was dying, tonight, now, with or without the beast. And the beast had simply come to collect early. Above her, a voice rose smooth and commanding over the chaos. And it was Corvin stepping into the center of the ring with his arms spread, taking command of the frightened pack, as though he had been waiting all his life for exactly this moment, which of course he had. "Seal the gates," Corvin cried. Send for the healers. Stand back and give the king air. His grieving face was a marvel of craft. No one leaves this hole tonight, until I know who loosed that creature upon us. He turned slowly, letting the pack see him take charge, letting them feel how steady he was, while their king bled on the stones. And Lynette understood that this too had been part of it. The beast had been meant for her, but if it took the king instead, Corvin lost nothing. He had built a trap that paid him no matter which of them died in it. For one instant, his eyes found Lynette kneeling over the fallen king, and in them she saw the truth he would never say aloud, and a cold patience that was worse than any hatred. Heal him, that look said, and show them all what you are. Or let him die, and I have won tonight. Either way, little witch, you are finished. Emmerich's hand closed weakly around her wrist, over the cloth, over the gray. Do not, he whispered, so low that only she could hear, whatever it costs you. I saw your arm, Lynette, weeks ago. I have known what you are and what it does to you since the night you first sat at my hearth, and I have said nothing, because it was yours to tell. He drew a breath that rattled. Do not spend yourself on me. Promise me. Let me go, and walk back down that mountain, and live. Please. And Lynette knelt there in the torchlight over her dying husband, with his enemy taking his kingdom 10 steps away, and she understood that she had come, at last, to the choice her whole strange life had been walking toward. To keep her promise and her life and lose him, or to break open the door inside her one final time, pour out everything she had into the most hollowed wolf in Carneth, and save him with the last of herself, while the whole court watched the weed witch die on the stones. She looked down into his gold eyes, and she made her choice. She chose him. Of course, she chose him. She had chosen him, she thought, from the first night she heard him hiding his cough behind a barred door, too proud to let a soul know he was afraid. Lynette pressed both hands flat to the wound at his chest, and in front of the whole pack of Carneth, under the risen moon, she broke open the door inside her all the way past the careful measure she had kept her whole life, past the point her mother had told her never to pass, and she poured. It was nothing like the small healings. This was a flood. She felt the hollowing in him rise to meet her, immense and cold and ancient, and she did not burn it away carefully this time, coin by coin. She threw everything she had into the fire at once, her strength, her years, the green unspent brightness at the very bottom of her that she had been hoarding against her own death. She gave it all to a dying king on a cold courtyard floor, and she felt the wound in his chest knit under her hands, felt the gray go out of his blood, felt, deep inside him, a great silenced wolf stir and lift its head and open its eyes. Emmerich drew a breath that did not rattle. It was the first clean breath she had ever heard him take. She felt it go through him, felt the year of slow poison loosen its grip, finger by finger, felt the great buried wolf come up toward the surface of him, like a drowned thing, breaking water at last. Around them the courtyard had gone utterly silent. Every wolf in Carneth was watching light pour out of a barefoot omega, and into the king they had all quietly given up for dead. And Lynette fell. She heard the pack cry out somewhere very far above her. She felt the gray come rushing home to roost, up her arms, across her chest, into her face, filling her the way water fills a sinking boat, and she thought, with the last clear corner of her mind, that this was a fair trade, and she did not regret it. She had walked 3 days to save this pack, and she was going to finish the walk here, on the stones, and that was all right. Then something caught her. Not hands. Deeper than hands. As the dark closed over her, the half-formed thing between them, the bond she had spent weeks refusing, reached across the fading gap of its own accord and would not let her go. She felt it seize her like a hand closing around a wrist at the edge of a cliff. She felt something pour back into her thin and desperate, a single bright thread of the very life she had just given him, his newly woken wolf, refusing, with all the blind stubbornness of a freshly living thing, to let its other half die. It was not enough to heal her, it was only enough to keep her breathing. Lynette came back to the world, grayed to the throat, hollow-eyed, so weak she could not lift her own head, but alive. And the whole pack of Carneth had watched a barefoot Omega pour her own life into their king, until she nearly died of it, and something in the courtyard had shifted that Corvin, for all his cleverness, could not shift back. You cannot make a pack hate the woman they have just watched, trade her life for their king's. You can only wait and hope they forget. Corvin was very good at waiting. He did not fight the king's survival. He wept over it, publicly, the loving cousin, and then he spoke gently to the frightened captains about how their poor king was clearly too weakened to bear the burden of rule, how he must be given time and quiet to recover far from the strain of the court, how Corvin himself would shoulder the sad duty of keeping Carneth safe in the meanwhile. By the time the sun rose, the king was alive, and the kingdom was Corvin's in all but name, and both of those things suited him equally well. They took Emmerich and Lynette to Ferngard 3 days later, for the king's recovery, which was the story everyone agreed to tell. Ferngard was a lodge of dark old timber at the edge of the high forest, a day's ride above the tree line, forgotten by everyone but the family that had once summered there. It had been Emmerich's, as a boy, in the years before the crown fell on him. He told her that, on the first evening sitting by a fire, that, for once he did not have to hide behind, his color coming back by the hour now that no poisoned cup could reach him. "This was the only place I was ever simply a boy," he said. Not the second son, not the spare, just a boy who was allowed to climb things and fall out of them. And now, strangely, terribly, it was Lynette who could not climb, and Emmerich who carried her. He carried her out to the porch in the mornings so she could feel the sun. He learned which of her hands ached and how to warm them. He brought her broth and sat with her while she drank it, patient as she had once been patient with his sister. And Lynette, who had spent her whole life as the one who tended and never the one tended to, did not know what to do with the enormous careful gentleness of it. It undid her more than any hardship could have. She kept waiting for it to become a burden to him, for the patience to thin, for the first flicker of resentment at being chained to a dying woman who could give him nothing now. It never came. He read to her in the evenings in his low, dry voice. He described the forest she was too weak to walk into, the deer at the salt lick, the way the light came green through the high pines, so that she could see it without leaving her chair. He did all of it as though it were not a chore at all, but the only thing in the world he wished to be doing, and slowly, against her own hard-learned wisdom, Lynette began to believe him. "You should not waste this on me," she told him one gray afternoon. Her voice was a thread. "I am spent, Emmerich. Healers of my line do not come back from this. I gave too much. You should save your strength for taking back your kingdom." Merrick set down the cup he was holding. "Tell me about the ash veil," he said instead. "The real telling. Not the one you give strangers," so she told him. There at last, in the failing light, she told him the true thing she had carried for so long. She told him about the terraced valley, where the green-blooded healers had lived for 1,000 years, quiet and hidden, asking nothing of anyone, healing who came to them and paying the price in secret. She told him how a neighboring pack had learned what the healers could do, and had wanted it, the way frightened, powerful wolves always want the thing that can save them, and had come in the night to take the healers by force, and keep them caged and use their gift until there was nothing left. She told him about the fire her mother had set to cover their escape, and how few had escaped it, and how her mother had died 3 days down the mountain from a wound she would not spend her own life to heal because she was saving it, every last drop, for the daughter she was dragging towards safety. "Keep it hidden," her mother had said, at the end, in the smoke, and Lynette had, and for 11 years she had. Emmerich listened to all of it without once looking away, and when she was done, He did not offer her comfort which she could not have borne, and he did not push at the parts that still bled. He only took her gray and ruined hand very carefully in both of his, the first time she had let herself be touched in weeks, and he held it as though it were the most valuable thing in the mountains, and he said, "You were never a tool in it. Not to me, not for one single hour." She began to cry. Then, silently, and he did not tell her to stop. It was a lie. She would let herself believe for exactly one more day. Because on the second morning at Ferngard, a rider came up the mountain half dead from the pace, and the news he carried put out the small, warm fire that had almost begun to burn. Corvin had called the pack to a full moon council. 12 days hence he had invoked the oldest law of Karna. If the king could not stand before the whole pack under the full moon and shift into his wolf, proving his strength unbroken, then he would be named Hollow-Lost, stripped of the alpha line, and the crown would pass to the strongest wolf of the blood who remained. And to be certain the king came, and came alone, and came desperate. Corvin had taken the Lady Brioni into his keeping. For her protection, he said, in these frightening times. Emmerich read the message twice. Then he looked at Lynette across the little room, and she saw in his face that he already knew the shape of the only door out, and that he hated it, and that he had already decided to walk through it alone. He could not shift. That was the whole trap, and it was airtight. The acute wound was healed, and the poisoned cup was a day's ride behind him, but the hollowing had rooted in Emmerich across a year of slow murder, and a year of poison does not wash out in a week of mountain air. His wolf had woken on the courtyard stones. Yes, it stirred in him now close beneath the skin. But it was still half buried under gray, still too weak to answer a full shift, and in 12 days it would not be strong enough to stand before the pack and prove anything at all, unless someone healed him the rest of the way. Neither of them said it for a long time. They both knew what it meant. There was only one healer in the mountains who could burn the last of the hollowing out of him, and she was already dying of the first time she had tried. "I will go alone," Emmerich said at last, on the 4th night. "I will go down and face the council, and I will not shift, because I cannot, and I will lose." He said it steadily, a man laying out a plan he had already made peace with. "Corvin wants the crown, not a corpse in the open. If I yield it to him before the whole pack, he has no reason to kill me, and less reason to keep Briony. I will trade the throne for her life and yours." He looked at Lynette. "You will stay here. When it is done, you will go east, over the pass, and you will live somewhere. Corvin has never heard your name." "No," Lynette said. "Lynette, no," she said again. She was so weak, she had to grip the arm of the chair to sit forward, but her voice at least had come back to her, and she put every remaining scrap of herself into it. "You would give him everything. The crown, the pack, the well, still running gray, so it can kill the next 1,000 of them slowly, and your sister, raised by the wolf who poisoned her. And you think that is the honorable door. It is not honor, Emmerich. It is you deciding, one more time, that everyone else may spend themselves, but you may not be spent for. You did it in the courtyard. You are doing it now. You keep trying to walk down the mountain alone, so that no one has to pay for you, and you would rather lose the whole world than let someone love you enough to." He went very still. "I know what you are doing," she said, more quietly. "I have done it my whole life. Keep it hidden. Cost no one anything. Die politely behind a barred door." She reached out and took his hand, and this time she did not flinch from the pull that came with it, the bond, leaning between them, stronger, every day. "I am done with that door," she said. "I am asking you to be done with it too." "You do not understand," he said, and for the first time the steadiness cracked, and what was underneath it was not calm at all. It was terror. "I have already lost everyone, Lynette. My mother and father to the last plague, years ago. My elder brother to the gray the very winter it began, which is how a crown I never wanted came to fall on the spare. A year of my own pack to the gray since, one funeral at a time. and me unable to stop a single death of it. He turned her gray hand over in his, staring at the ruin the healing had made of her. I watched you nearly die on those stones for me, and I could do nothing but hold your wrist and beg. Do you understand what you are asking? You are asking me to sit and watch it happen again, slower, and call it love. I cannot. I would rather you hate me and live than love me and die of it. Emmerich looked down at their joined hands, hers gray and wasted, his warming with the life she had given him, and for a long moment, the whole of him seemed to be at war. If you heal me the rest of the way, he said, finally, his voice rough, it will kill you. You said it yourself. Healers of your line do not come back from this. He shook his head slowly. I have already taken more of your life than I can ever give back. I will not take the last of it. I would rather lose the crown and every stone of Karnath than stand before that pack as their strong king, with your death on my hands. Ask me for anything but that. Anything. There is another way, Lynette said. And she told him what she had been turning over since the courtyard, the thing she had felt in the instant she began to fall, when the half-formed bond had reached across the dark and poured a thread of his new life back into her and kept her breathing. A true bond, complete, freely given on both sides, did not run one way. It was not a healer pouring herself out into a bottomless wolf until there was nothing left. It was a circle. What she spent, he would return. What he spent, she would return. The burden that would kill one of them carrying it alone might be survived, might even be borne, if it were shared between two who had chosen it. Might, Emmerich repeated. Might, she agreed. I will not lie to you and call it certain. No healer of my line ever lived long enough to try it, because no wolf ever loved one of us enough to offer. She held his gaze. But you asked me for another way, and this is the only one there is. Complete the bond, truly, and let us find out together whether two people can carry what neither can carry alone. Think of everything you have carried by yourself, she went on. Gentler now, the crown. The pack dying under your hands, your own poisoning, hidden so no one would smell your fear. You have spent a year being strong alone because you believed there was no one to share the weight with. There is now. That is what a true bond is. Emmerich. Not a chain, not a debt. It is two wolves refusing, at last, to bleed in separate rooms. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind came down off the high peaks and worried at the old timbers of the one place Emmerich of Karnath had ever been allowed to be a child. He looked at the gray climbing her throat and the stubborn light that had not left her eyes even now, and Lynette felt the exact moment his war ended, felt it through the bond like the sun coming out, and he reached up and cupped her thin face in his warm and living hand and said, very low, the truest and most reckless thing she had ever heard him say. Then teach me how, he said. For one breath the whole ruined year fell away from his face, and he was only a man who had decided, against all his careful terror, to be brave in the one way that frightened him most, which was to let himself be loved. He drew her in against him, careful of her weakness, and pressed his mouth to her hair, and Lynette closed her eyes and let herself believe, for the space of a single heartbeat, that the world might yet let them have this. But before she could answer, hoofbeats sounded on the frozen track below the lodge, more than one rider, coming fast and unfriendly in the dark, and Emmerich was on his feet with his hand on his blade, because they had run out of the one thing neither of them had ever truly had. They had run out of time. The riders were Tovin and 8 of the king's own guard, the last wolves in Karnath, still loyal enough to desert Corvin and ride through the night to warn their king. What they brought was worse than pursuit. Corvin had not been willing to wait 12 days after all. He had put it about the capital that the king was dead at Ferngard of his wounds, that the Omega Witch had finished what the beast began, and he had called the full moon council for the very next night, meaning to take the crown over an empty chair before any word could reach the pack to say otherwise. If Emmerich wanted to save his sister and his kingdom, he had until moonrise, and Ferngard was most of a day's hard ride from the capital. They rode through what was left of the night and all the gray day. Linnet rode before Emeric on his own horse, wrapped in his cloak, too weak to sit a saddle alone, and somewhere in the cold hours of that ride, with the mountains going by and no priest and no witnesses and no time, they did the thing that could not wait for a better moment. He told her he loved her. He said it plainly, into her hair, a man who had spent his whole life, refusing to spend himself, finally spending the one thing he had left. And Linnet, who had been told to keep everything hidden, who had never once in her life said this thing aloud to another living soul, turned in the circle of his arms and said it back. "I choose you," she told him, "not the king. Not the crown. You, whatever it costs, whatever comes. I choose this, freely, with my whole eyes open." And the bond, which had been waiting at the edge of them for weeks, like a held breath, completed. She felt it lock into place, with a sensation like a bone going home into its socket, like a door she had kept barred her whole life swinging finally open onto air and light. The one-way flood became a circle. She felt his living strength come pouring into the gray ruin of her, steady and warm and endless. And she felt her own healer's gift settle into him, like roots taking hold. And for the first time in 11 years, Linnet was not alone behind a barred door. There was someone on the other side of it now, holding it open, and he was not going to let it close. And she felt him, all of him, suddenly. The way you feel the sun on your face after a long winter indoors. She felt the boy, who had climbed things and fallen out of them at Ferngard. She felt the crushing loneliness of the crown, the year of hidden dying, the terror behind every steady word he had ever spoken to her. And beneath all of it, woven through the whole of him like a root through stone, she felt the thing he had refused for so long to say, and had finally said into her hair, in the cold. She felt that he loved her, not the healer, not the miracle, not the tool that had saved his pack, but her, the barefoot woman who had knelt on his floor and asked for nothing. It was almost too much to bear. She had spent her whole life certain that if anyone ever truly saw her, they would look away. Emeric had seen all the way to the bottom of her, and he had not looked away, and he was never going to. The gray did not vanish. And then, slowly, as they rode, it began to recede. They came down out of the mountains, as the sun was setting, and rode through the gates of Carnath as the moon rose, and into a high courtyard, packed with the whole waiting pack, and a golden wolf in the center of the ring, arms spread, mid-speech, telling 600 grieving wolves that their king was dead and their crown was his. Emeric rode into the torchlight and put back his hood. The silence was the loudest thing Linnet had ever heard. "You have buried me early, cousin," Emeric said, and his voice carried to the last stone of that courtyard. "It seems to be a habit of yours, burying the pack of Carnath before its time." Corvin recovered quickly. He was always quick. "A trick," he cried, to the wavering pack. "Look at him, propped on his witch gray as the grave. Ask him to prove it. Ask him to shift, if he is your king. Let the moon show us what he is." He knew. Even now he knew the trap still held, because a dead man and a hollow lost man came to the same throne in the end. Emeric swung down from the horse. He lifted Linnet down after him and set her gently on her feet, and she stood swaying, her hand in his. "Now," she whispered. Together. She did not pour into him this time. She opened the circle. And Emeric, for the first time in a year, stopped holding his dying up alone, and let her carry half of it, and reached down through the bond into the woken wolf beneath his skin, and called it up into the light. The shift took him between one heartbeat and the next. Where the king had stood there rose a wolf out of the old stories, vast and dark and shining. No gray anywhere in him, a thing of such plain living power that the whole pack of Carnath went to its knees, in the oldest reflex any wolf has, and Corvin's carefully built lie fell down around him in the space of a single breath. This was no hollow lost husk, propped up by a witch. This was the true alpha of Carnath in his full strength, and every wolf in that courtyard felt it roll off him like heat off a fire, felt their own silenced wolves lift their heads in answer, and knew, past any speech Corvin could ever make, exactly who their king was. Somewhere in the crowd, an old captain began the salute, fist to heart, and it moved through the pack like wind through grass until 600 wolves stood with their hands over their hearts, for the king they had been told was dead. But Corvin had built more than one trap, and a cornered schemer is the most dangerous kind. He snatched a blade from the guard beside him and lunged, not at the great wolf he could never beat, but at the swaying gray woman standing alone beside it, because he understood at last what she was to the king and knew that killing her was the only wound left that could still land. He never reached her. Tovin and the guard were on him before he had taken a second step, and the golden wolf, who had poisoned a whole pack for a crown, went down in the center of the ring where he had loosed his mad beast and did not rise. From the edge of the crowd, a clear voice cried out the rest of it, Bryony's voice freed and furious, naming the poisoned well and the poisoned cup and the Lady Delphine, who had carried the grey draught with her own hands. The girl Lynette had twice pulled back from death, now stood before the whole court, and told them how she had been kept these last days as a hostage, how she had heard Corvin and Delphine speak plainly of the well, when they thought no one who mattered could hear. And this time there was proof beyond one girl's word, because the king's own living wolf stood in the center of the ring as witness that everything Corvin had built his claim upon had been a lie. The captains, who had wavered, went to seize Delphine where she stood frozen at the edge of the dais, and she did not run, because there was nowhere left in Karneth for such a wolf to run to. It was over more quickly than a year of suffering had any right to end. When the great dark wolf shifted back into the shape of a man, Emeric did not raise his fist to the pack, or claim his throne, or name his enemies. He crossed the ring straight to Lynette, who was still standing, only because she had refused to sit, and he took her face in both of his hands in front of every wolf who had ever called her weed witch and stray, and he pressed his forehead to hers, and through the open circle of the bond, she felt what he did not say aloud. Relief past all speaking, grief for the year they had each spent dying alone, and under it, holding it all up, that same steady root of a thing that no crown or council or cornered schemer had ever been able to touch. The pack watched their king bow his head to the Omega, and not one wolf among them laughed. In the days that followed, they drained the moon well and dug down to the grey filth Corvin's people had packed into its deep stones, and they cleared it, and clean water rose in Karneth again for the first time in a year. And Lynette, no longer bailing a boat with a hole in it, no longer alone, healed the pack. She went house by house through the low quarter and the high, and she poured. And now what she poured came back to her, through the bond, as fast as she gave it, drawn from a king in his full strength, and a whole pack growing stronger by the day so that she could give and give and give and not die of it. The change moved through Karneth like spring, through a frozen valley. In the low houses along the wall, where the court had never set foot, mothers who had been keeping vigil over grey children felt those small chests fill with clean breath under Lynette's hands. Old wolves who had not shifted in a year felt their second selves stir and wake. The captains who had knelt to Corvin came, one by one, to kneel to the Omega instead, not because a law made them, but because they had watched her nearly die twice for a pack that had given her nothing but scorn, and there is no wolf living who does not know that kind of loyalty when he finally sees it. The grey went out of Karneth wolf by wolf. Children who had been fading sat up and asked for food. The hollowing, which the pack had believed a curse from the gods, turned out to have been only the cruelty of one ambitious wolf all along. And it ended the way cruelty ends when someone finally refuses to keep it secret. One herb had walked 3 days into a dying pack and changed everything, but the herb had only ever been a door. The thing that came through it in the end was a woman who would not stay hidden, and a wolf who learned, almost too late, how to be saved. They held the true binding in the spring, when the mountain was green again, and the terraces of the reclaimed valley were being planted for the first time in 11 years. Linnet had gone back to the Ashvale at the snowmelt, with Amaric beside her, and 100 wolves of Carneth at her back, who had asked, shyly, if they might help. Together they had cleared the burned terraces and turned the old soil and set the first green shoots into ground that had known nothing but ash for more than a decade. Green-blooded healers would grow in that valley again, one day. Not hidden this time. Not bled in secret. Simply living. In the open. Under a sky that no longer had to hate them. It had been strange. Standing again in the valley, where her whole world had burned. She had braced for grief, and found instead that the grief had somewhere to go now. Every shoot they planted was an argument against the wolves who had come in the night with torches. Every wolf of Carneth, kneeling in the old healer's soil, learning from her which herbs wanted shade and which wanted sun, was a promise that what had happened to her mother's people would not be allowed to happen again. And Merrick had worked beside her the whole while, dirt to the elbows, a king-turned-gardener, and she had caught him more than once, simply watching her among the green, with a look on his face that she had learned, at last, to let herself believe. She stood now in the great hall of Carneth, where she had once knelt on the cold floor, with a weed in a basket, while the whole court laughed. No one was laughing. The pack that had called her weed witch and stray now pressed close to see her, healthy and whole, no gray anywhere on her, the color high in her face. A child near the front, too young to remember the bad year, tugged its mother's sleeve and asked who the lady was. "That is the queen," the mother said. "She walked 3 days over the mountains to save us, when she owed us nothing at all. And she near died of it twice, and stayed, anyway." There, at the head of the hall, Emeric took Linnet's hands in his, both of them living, both of them warm, the bond between them glowing steady as a banked fire that would never again be allowed to go cold. Bryony stood beside them, grown taller over the winter, grinning like it was the best day of her life, which she would later insist that it was. They had each spent their whole lives dying quietly behind their own barred doors, certain that the truth of them was a thing the world could not be allowed to see. And then one of them had walked 3 days through the cold to save a stranger, and found, at the end of the road, not a stranger at all. They had been no one's first choice, either of them. But standing in the green spring light, hand in warm living hand, they had chosen each other, freely, with their whole eyes open. And that, it turned out, had been the only cure that ever mattered. I hope this one stayed with you. Do you think Emeric was right to keep refusing the bond to protect Linnet from his own dying? Or was he a stubborn fool who nearly cost them both everything by trying to carry it alone? Tell me in the comments. I would love to know. And I will see you very soon for another story.